Hi everyone, in this video we'll look at some more writing mechanics. So these are some of the most common mistakes that I found students make in their writing. And so we'll look at some ways to fix them and some ways to avoid making them. The first thing I want to talk about is vague pronoun references. Vague pronoun references are really common and they end up confusing your reader. Your reader often has to look back to try and figure out what you're talking about. Sometimes they can have amusing results, but more often not, they're just really frustrating. So at the risk of sounding too much like a grammar exercise, we do need to remind ourselves what pronouns are. We use pronouns all the time. They take the place of a noun in a sentence. So instead of repeatedly saying someone's name, we might say he or she or herself. You might refer to you or I or that, they, etc. Or we use these words commonly in speech and writing. We're all familiar with them. Pronouns have to have a clear relationship between the antecedent, so the noun that they're referring to, and the pronoun. So as this helpful tip from writingincommons.org says, the word to which the pronoun refers is generally called the antecedent. Pronouns need to agree in number, agree in person, and refer clearly to a specific noun. A common mistake is using pronouns, particularly the pronouns it, which, that, and this without a clear antecedent. We get lost. What does it refer to? Who is he? Who is she? What is that? So for example, the first sentence, before Mary drove Susie home, she phoned Deb. Who is doing the phoning in this case? Who phoned Deb? It could be either Mary or it could be Susie. We don't know because the she could refer back to either of those people in the first part of the sentence. In the second example, take the drive out of the computer and fix it. What does it refer to? Are we talking about fixing the computer or are we talking about fixing the drive? Of course, we could be talking about either one of those. These are vague pronoun references. In the third example, the teachers told the students that they were cheating too frequently. Who is they? Is the they the teachers or is they the students? Now we would clearly assume that the they is students because students are all, a nasty bunch of cheaters. But in fact, it's not clear that that's what we mean. We could be talking about the teachers cheating and in fact might be discussing something far more scandalous. So we could fix all of these cases by simply using whichever noun we actually are referring to, replacing the pronoun with the antecedent. So if we're talking about Mary in the first sentence, we could say, before Mary drove Susie home, Mary phoned Deb. We could say, take the drive out of the computer and fix the computer, or fix the drive, whichever one we're talking about. The teachers told the students that the students were cheating too frequently. You could also rewrite these sentences or restructure them to avoid that problem of the vague pronoun reference. So watch carefully, especially using pronouns like it, especially at the end of a sentence, like in the second example. What does it refer to? One of the biggest problems that we come across is wordiness, using excess words, unnecessary words, to make the same point that could be made using much fewer words. So here are some good strategies for reducing wordiness in your writing. Get rid of words like which or that whenever possible. So you can see in my wordy and concise examples, I've included word counts at the end of the sentences to show how many fewer words you can use by eliminating these few words. Because the fluid, which was brown and poisonous, was dumped into the river, the company that was negligent had to shut down. Simply rewriting that and getting rid of the which or that phrases, we can say because the brown poisonous fluid was dumped into the river, the negligent company had to shut down. We've saved ourselves 5 whole words in that one sentence, which is wonderful. Always get rid of so, it is, there are, this from the beginning of sentences. These add nothing to a sentence. For example, so, the argument is clear. What does the so do? Nothing. Get rid of it. It is clear that this argument is convincing. Why would you need to say that? Just cross it out. This argument is convincing. Dylan's argument has been supported many times. This contributes to its effectiveness. Not only has the this contributed an unnecessary word to this example, but it's also forced us to use 2 separate sentences when we could just use one sentence and get rid of that word. Dylan's argument has been supported many times, contributing to its effectiveness. Avoid using the passive voice. The passive voice is a little bit of a tricky one to figure out. It's when you write something or speak in a manner that removes responsibility from the actor. The example I always use of this is my 3-year-old who often knocks over his water when we're eating a meal, and I'll leave the room and come back and there'll be water all over the floor, and I'll say, "Hey, what happened?" And he'll say, "It got knocked over." He doesn't say I knocked it over. He's very strategically used the passive voice to remove himself as the actor from the sentence, to remove the responsibility from himself. So by saying it got knocked over, it's not clear that he's the one who knocked it over. Now, of course, he was the one who knocked it over. You also see this often in newspaper headlines or news reports that say something like, suspect was shot, or suspect was shot by police. Right? That places the emphasis not on the person doing the shooting, not on the police for having shot someone, but on the action that took place. Now, not only does this remove responsibility from the person who conducted the action or who undertook the action, but also generally is more wordy than simply using the active voice. So for example, the argument was made effectively by the author. Switch that around and say the author made the argument effectively. Similarly, it is argued that WordPress is an effective tool. All we need to say in this case is WordPress is an effective tool. So avoid the passive voice. There are some instances where you want to use the passive voice strategically, and if you're writing for the sciences, if you're working in a science discipline, often the passive voice is used because the results of an experiment are more important than the person conducting the experiment. But you'll discover that as you move through your academic career. Some really common wordy phrases. Why write for the purpose of when you could simply write to? Get rid of due to the fact that and replace it with because. At this point in time, no, all you mean is now. In the near future, you mean soon. With regard to, about. And my favorite, in view of the fact that. This is 6 totally unnecessary words. All you really need to write is because. Also things like as the case may be or basically at the start of a sentence, just delete those. Cross them off. They're not doing you any good. They're not contributing anything to the argument that you're making. Also be careful about to be's and beings. These can creep in and are largely unnecessary. The argument was considered to be convincing. The argument was considered convincing. Because of the subject matter being difficult? No, because of the difficult subject matter. There's some good practice exercises if you want to work through them on the Online Writing Lab, Purdue's Online Writing Lab there, or on grammar.ccc. Also, I think a really useful exercise, if you're not a Twitter user, sign up for a Twitter account and just try saying something meaningful in 140 characters. Twitter limits you, if you're not a Twitter user, Twitter limits you to 140 characters. So try and just experiment with that. See if you can actually say something meaningful using only 140 characters. It's also useful to read other people who are strong Twitter users, how they condense their language to fit within that character limit. Now, I don't want to see essays that use many of the abbreviations that are used online or in text messaging, of course. But simply being more concise and being economical with your language can really be affected by Twitter use. Check it out. Parallelism. Parallelism is an important one. What does parallel mean? The definition of parallel is 2 lines that if they ran forever would never cross, which is a little bit mind-blowing. So the 2 lines in this example are meant to be a visual version of the grammatical and rhetorical error of parallelism. So we have 2 different types, grammatical and rhetorical parallelism. Grammatical parallelism, we see this turning out fairly regularly. They like running, biking, and to swim. We don't have the same forms here. They like running, biking, and swimming. On Mondays, Tuesdays, or on Wednesdays. You either need to say on Mondays, or on Tuesdays, or on Wednesdays, or on Mondays, Tuesdays, or Wednesdays. I will stop reading and went to the store. We know that this doesn't work. It's the two parts of that sentence are parallel. I will stop reading and go to the store, or I stopped reading and went to the store. So grammatical parallelism creeps in and can be easily edited out, making sure that the sentences follow the same form across the various parts, especially within lists of things, like in the first example. Rhetorical parallelism often shows up in common phrases or sayings, and is useful because it helps people remember things. For example, what you see is what you get. You can see how the two parts of this sentence are parallel in construction, the what you see and the what you get. Another example, this Winston Churchill quote, which who knows, may or may not be a Churchill quote. There are many fake Churchill quotes online. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. And the second part, the inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. We're familiar with a lot of these parallel constructions in, like I said, aphorisms or common sayings. Easy come, easy go. If you happen to be a fan of Victorian literature, one of the most famous Victorian novels starts off with a long list of parallel symbols or parallel sentence constructions. It is, of course, Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. We get this long list of parallel statements to start the novel. Moving on from parallelism into in-text citations. So we've talked about this a little bit already this semester, but it's probably worth reviewing. So in-text citations are how you give credit once you've cited something or paraphrased something. So you've done some research, you found some resources, and then you're starting to build that into your research essay, and you have to give credit to those previous authors or those previous texts. We've got three most common models for this are Chicago, MLA, or APA. So Chicago uses a superscript number that refers the reader to a footnote or endnote, and MLA and APA, which I suspect most people will be using, use in-text citations. So these come at the end of a sentence or sometimes in the middle of a sentence, and they're surrounded by parentheses, and they contain specific information. So if you want to use Chicago, that's fine. It's a little bit more work. It's sometimes cleaner and nicer to read. Most commonly, you'll be using APA if you go into other courses and other disciplines. MLA is most often used in humanities, English, comparative literature, those sorts of disciplines. APA is most commonly used across a wide range of disciplines. So if you have to pick one to get to know how to use, probably go with APA. In some disciplines, you'll be required to use Chicago or required to use MLA. In many ways, they're similar, and once you figure out how to use one, you can easily make the transition to the next or to a different form. So each of these three examples, each of these three styles, whether it's a footnote or endnote in Chicago or an in-text citation in MLA or APA, all of these refer to specific entries in your bibliography or your works cited, which goes at the end of the paper. You can see that with Chicago, if we have a little example here, this would be the 34th footnote or endnote in this paper. Notice that the actual number, the superscript number, goes after the period at the end of the sentence. So let's have a look at some examples of these. If you're Slavoj Žižek fans, and who isn't, you'll recognize Žižek from the picture. He's a wonderful Slovenian philosopher. Check out his YouTube videos for some wildly entertaining clips. So here's a sentence that quotes from Žižek using Chicago. Only through, and we have a quote, an over-identification with the domain of imagination can we enter the violent domain of pre-synthetic imagination and encounter our fundamental fantasy. And then we've got our footnote here, so that would tell our reader, go to the end of the paper. There's a list there, look for the 24th footnote or endnote, and you'll see the reference material for that quote. MLA and APA work a little bit differently, so we have the same quote, but then we have the in-text citation, which has the author's last name, no punctuation, and then simply the page number. Also note that the period goes after the closed parentheses. So this quote that we've used in this sentence comes on page 122 of the Zizek text. Now if we went to the bibliography or the works cited list at the end of the paper, we'd find an entry for Zizek, and it would have a bunch more information like the title of the text and the place of publication, the publisher, and the page numbers and the titles and all that stuff. And so we would then know that that's where this quote originated. So there's the MLA style, simply author's last name and the page number, no punctuation. We have an APA example. It's the same quote again. Again, the period goes after the closed parentheses at the very end of the sentence. But in APA, you include the author's last name, then a comma, then the date of publication, another comma, and then a P dot for page number, and then the page number. Now, if you've mentioned any of these things in the text of the sentence, or even in adjacent sentences so that it's obvious to which reference you're referring, you don't need to reproduce them. So if in this sentence I had said something like, Zizek argues that only through an over-identification, etc., I wouldn't need to put that in the reference, in the in-text citation, because it would be a little bit redundant. That said, if you're ever unsure about what information to include, it's always better to include more. So you've chosen your referencing style, you've done your research, you got a bunch of resources, and now you have to actually incorporate that evidence into your research essay. The two most common ways are by quoting or paraphrasing from those resources. So let's have a quick look at some strategies for actually incorporating that evidence. So it's important to note when you're quoting that you don't abandon your quotes. This is an example of a quote that's entirely been abandoned. So if this is my research essay and I've written Zizek describes this in his third chapter, then I've got a period. I've got a start of a quote. One acts as if the barrier obstacle is not already in language itself. This is my MLA format. I've just got the page number, and then I've got a period. This quote has been entirely abandoned. It's not built into the flow of my writing. It's entirely without context. I've started up the next paragraph or the next sentence here in later chapters, etc. Don't do this. There are a couple good reasons why you shouldn't do this. First, your voice starts to get lost if your voice isn't part of every sentence, and you need to be the dominant voice of your research essay. If you have a whole list of quotes and they're not put into context, the other author's voices start to take over. Second, your reader needs to know why you've included this quote. It might be obvious to you from the sentences surrounding the quote why you've built it in, but it won't be to your reader. And your reader might wonder why you've included it, what it means, how it's supporting or disagreeing with your point. So what if you'd actually put this in as an example of the opposite of what you were saying? Your reader might not pick up on that and could get really confused and really concerned that your argument seems to be inconsistent and jumping all over the place. So make sure that you build them in. Build in your quotes. For example, Zizek notes that the Tamagotchi is, so those are my words, and then we're moving into the quote. Zizek notes that the Tamagotchi is breeding a number of virtual murderers among children, giving rise to the cyberspace counterpart of the sadistic child torturing a cat or a butterfly to death. I told you Zizek was fun. And that's on page 106. We have another MLA in-text citation there. The period goes after the closed parentheses. Someone once said in class, and I think this is a good suggestion, that if you were reading this out loud, that the listener wouldn't know where your words stop and the quoted material begins. It should be integrated that smoothly and that flawlessly that it should just flow nicely across your words, from your words across to the quoted material. As I said, build them in. Sometimes you have to modify quotes slightly. So in this example here, I've added the but only. If you have to add words to clarify things, so for example, if you need to clear up a vague pronoun reference in a quote, then you can do that, but you have to be really careful about not changing the meaning of it, not changing the original spirit of the thing, and also indicating that you've added words by including them or surrounding them by square brackets. if you have a quote within a quote, like in this example, use single quotation marks for the inside quote. Double quotation marks on the outside, single quotation marks on the inside. If you have to remove material from something you've quoted, you can do that, again, as long as you don't change the meaning of it, and you indicate that by 3 dots, 3 periods, known as ellipses. So you can add things, as long as they don't change the meaning, by doing so within square brackets, and you can remove things, so long as it doesn't change the meaning, by indicating that with 3 dots, 3 ellipses. If you have a quote within a quote, which does happen sometimes, the interior quote uses single quotation marks. The exterior quote always uses double quotation marks. Always build them in. Block quotations comes up fairly regularly, although in papers as short as the ones you are working on, I would expect to see no block quotes, or at least very few. So block quotes are used in MLA if you are quoting from the original more than 4 lines in sequence. So if your quote is 4 lines or more, and you're using MLA, you need to set off the material by indenting it, by changing the margins on both ends, by introducing it with a colon, and by putting the reference, the in-text citation, outside of the closing period. And as you'll notice, there are no quotation marks. So there's very specific formatting for block quotes. And like I said, 4 lines from the original in MLA, and if you're using APA, if you're quoting 40 or more words in sequence, so in one quote. That's not 40 or more words across all of the quotes from a certain reference. That's 40 or more words in one quote. So it will look like this. You can also change it from single or from double spacing to single spacing if you want. That's sort of optional. As I said, your papers are very short for this class, and so I'd be expecting to see almost no block quotes across the entire course, across the entire class's set of essays. If you have a wonderful quote that's 41 words and you just have to build it in, fine, do so, but make sure you've correctly formatted that using block quotes. Alongside quoting, paraphrasing is the most common way of incorporating evidence from your resources. So as you can see here, I'm paraphrasing from some of Zizek's texts. So I said the law is the object of desire and source of enjoyment for the pervert. This is a wonderful quote that uses a totally different definition of pervert than we're used to. It's taking pervert to mean perverse, which it actually is the root of the word, and perverse simply meaning doing the opposite of what's expected, or the opposite of the norm. So anyone who is kind of a shit disturber or contrarian is in fact being perverse, is doing something perverted. And so Zizek plays with that a lot, particularly because the word pervert has such strong connotations for us. So in this example, I've simply paraphrased from Zizek on page 117, again using MLA. There's the reference, the in-text citation. All I've done is put the page number in because it was clear that we're talking about Zizek. Zizek's 4th mode of engagement with cyberspace resembles the dialectical synthesis of the first 3, and then my essay continues after the paraphrasing. Another example, paraphrasing from Zizek, the Tamagotchi has no emotion, only signals of emotion. These aren't my ideas. I'm borrowing them from Zizek in order to support my claim, to support my thesis, to support my argument, but I have to give credit to the originator of the idea. So I need to include that reference, that in-text citation. Again, here only the page number is put in because for whatever reason it was clear that we were talking about Zizek. Often it's really effective to combine paraphrasing and quotation. So if you find yourself wanting to build in a bunch of lengthy quotes and trying to use a bunch of block quotations, maybe explore combining paraphrase and quotation. So quote some of it and paraphrase the rest of it. For example, Zizek notes that the Tamagotchi is, and we've got the same quote, breeding a number of virtual murderers among children, giving rise to the cyberspace counterpart of the sadistic child torturing a cat or a butterfly to death. I'm missing a period after this. There should be a period here, 106. Closing parentheses period. And then we move into a paraphrase. The Tamagotchi has no emotion, only signal of emotion. We know this is a quote because there's quotation marks, and those are the exact words from the original source. We know this is a paraphrase because I've given reference to the text and the page number, but there are no quotation marks. It's not a quote. Those are my words, but they're someone else's ideas. So combining quoting and paraphrasing can be really effective. Names, and particularly names of authors. So when you're referring to an author in your research essay, so maybe you found an article written by someone and you're referring to it several times, the first time you refer to a person, especially in an academic setting, use their full name. Here's a 2012 book, Catherine Hales notes that, etc., etc. So we use Catherine Hales' full name. Every time after that first mention, only use the person's last name. Hales goes on to say, etc. So the first time, use their full name. After that, only use their last name. Never refer to someone by their first name. This seems too casual and seems too disrespectful. If you end up in the strange situation where you have two different people with the same last name, use their first and, if possible, their middle initial to distinguish between them. So if we had two people named Hales, one Catherine Hales and one J.R. Hales, we just say K. Hales argues that our minds evolve alongside our media, and J.R. Hales claims that cognition undergoes dramatic paradigm shifts. This doesn't happen very often, but if it does, it's easy to get around. Just use the first initials. One of the most common things I point out are sentence fragments. Here are a couple of different definitions. This one from study.com. I'll leave you to read it in more detail on yourself, but it's, to paraphrase it, or to quote parts of it, sentence fragments are groups of words that look like sentences, but aren't words. I like the idea that fragments can masquerade as real sentences because they begin with a capital letter and end with a period. But if you read them more closely, you'll see that fragments don't form a complete thought. That's probably the best test to figure out whether what you've got is a fragment or a complete sentence. Read it out loud to yourself or read it out loud to someone else. If they're able to figure out what you're talking about, then it's probably fine as a complete sentence. But if they're left with basic questions about who you're talking about or what you're talking about or what you're saying, then in all likelihood it's a sentence fragment. Another example is from Purdue's online writing lab, the OWL. Fragments are incomplete sentences. Usually fragments are pieces of sentences that have become disconnected from the main clause. One of the easiest ways to correct them is to remove the period between the fragment and the main clause. Other kinds of punctuation may be needed for the newly combined sentence. Let's have a look at a few examples. So we've got some fragments on the left and the fixed versions on the right. So a sentence fragment, slammed the door and left. We say this out loud to ourselves. We're left with one obvious question: who slammed the door and left? So we fix this by adding, in this case, a pronoun. He slammed the door and left. We could fix it in any number of ways. Because his car was in the shop. Careful about sentences that start with words like because or if. We want to know what if we see this as a sentence. Because his car was in the shop, what? Because his car was in the shop, he walked. Similarly, if you want to go with me, what about this? This is very confusing. If you want to go with me, you'll have to walk. Another fragment, her cousin. What about her cousin? Her cousin is from Spain. Off the counter. What are we talking about? Who, what's going on? The vase fell off the counter. It's tempting to identify sentence fragments, to focus on length of sentences to identify sentence fragments, but in fact that can be misleading because correct sentences can be short. They ran is a fine sentence, it's a complete sentence. We're not left with any major questions after we read a simple sentence like they ran. And on the other hand, fragments can in fact be very long. Woke up, went for a run, had breakfast, got some work done, and then watched a movie and drove to Vancouver. It's pretty long, but that's a sentence fragment because you don't actually know who did this thing. So review some of the basic mechanics of sentences if you're finding that sentence fragments are a major problem within your writing. So that's the second set of writing mechanics that we're going to look at. Make sure you work to eliminate these specific writing errors from your work. There's a lot more information about all of these online. One of the best resources is the Purdue Online Writing Lab, the Purdue OWL. Definitely check that out if you have any questions or concerns, and don't hesitate to email me as well if you're confused about any of it.